Hey everybody, welcome to the next section of our Streamwatch volunteer training. This is the peer-to-peer education section, and we are going to talk about how to be a positive presence on the river. Again, I am Galen Hecht from Kenai Watershed Forum, one of the coordinators for the 2021 season. All right, let's get into this subject. First of all, a very important question. Why are fish so gullible? Just take a moment. Because they fall for things hook, line, and sinker. Who'd have thought? Anyway, I want to draw your attention to the corny joke section of your volunteer manual. When you open your volunteer manual for the first time, that may be the first thing that you want to go look at, because humor on the river can be a great way to connect with folks, and it can be an icebreaker as well. So Amber, our Chugach National Forest coordinator, very kindly went on a search for some great jokes, including the one that I just told, and I hope you adopt a few of those or bring some new ones along to really bring some good laughs to the river. It helps. Okay, so now down to business. We are not enforcement at Streamwatch. And this is an important point. We are positive influencers on the river. So we might have uniforms that are green. We have our symbol on the shirts. We look pretty official when we're in our Streamwatch Ambassador uniforms. And sometimes people think we're ADF&G or state parks or some kind of enforcement. We're not. And don't try to be. It's not our job. We're not there to enforce regulations or make people follow them. We're not there to point out all the flaws with the way that people recreate. Nothing like that. We're there to be positive influencers on the river. We want to encourage people to recreate responsibly, safely. We want to make sure that people are stewarding habitat and set that example ourselves, so that a culture of stewardship is the prevailing culture in recreation on the rivers of the Kenai Peninsula. That's really our goal, and we support agencies in doing that. We support agencies who do enforcement. There are resources in your volunteer manual, phone numbers that you can call to ADF&G or Forest Service rangers, state park rangers who can enforce. But that's not us. And it's really important to acknowledge that, because we are a group of dedicated individuals. We're citizens. We're there as peers. And that's really the essence of that peer-to-peer education. So we're approaching people as just folks on the same level that they are. So that's really important to bear in mind with Streamwatch, and can guide the way that you communicate with people, because it doesn't have to be so serious. We're just trying to have a good time and encourage other people to do the same. So I'm going to talk through some of the educational messaging that we use, and I encourage you to integrate this into the things that you do, but also to share your story, to share your knowledge with people, and, make it personal. It's fine to tell people why you're a Streamwatch ambassador, or how long you've been in Alaska. Do you fish? What's your favorite species or recipe for salmon? Those kinds of things are great. So, make it personal, dice in some of these messaging points that we provide for you through this training, and you'll be a great ambassador. Okay, here we go. So some of the really important messaging around land and history acknowledgement is something that folks find really interesting, and it's also very important. In particular, we want to talk about the sort of prehistory of the region a little bit with folks. If they're interested in geology in particular, if you know about geology, you can share more knowledge or learn about it and share a deeper understanding. But in general, the Kenai Peninsula was covered in ice completely until about 15,000 years ago. At the end of the Pleistocene, ice started to retreat, and glaciers carved out the Kenai Peninsula as we know it today, some of these big glacial lake basins, and deposited a lot of material on the western side of the peninsula, which is where rivers are flowing through these very happy wetland covered landscapes that provide lots of great habitat in the refuge in Chugach. And then on the eastern side of the peninsula, it's more rugged terrain. The Harding ice field is still there. There's still a lot of glacial activity, even down into the water on the coastline, but there's also pockets of rainforest, and it's just an incredible place. And that development happened since the last ice age, and as glaciers have been retreating since then. Another really important thing is to acknowledge the indigenous peoples of this region. The Knights-Saath Dena'ina people and Supiaq Alutiiq people have inhabited the Kenai Peninsula for time immemorial. Much gratitude for their stewardship of the region in the past and in the present. I mean, these folks are still here. Knights-Saath Indian tribe is still here. Folks in Seldovia and Port Graham have Alutiiq heritage, and we're so fortunate in this region to have their generations upon generations of stewardship that helped bring the Kenai Peninsula into the modern age with healthy salmon runs, lots of wildlife, and traces of ancestral Dena'ina and Alutiiq people and other peoples predating those cultures are all over the peninsula, including at Streamwatch sites up and down the river. And so it's really important to recognize that there's an immense cultural and historic background in these places where we are. And if you know more about that, if you want to share your knowledge, that's awesome. Again, let's learn about it together and share that knowledge with visitors to the area. The kind of last phase of settlement where Western cultures started to inhabit the peninsula started in the 19th and 20th century with Russian and English explorers who started coming here and trapping and beginning to settle the area, starting to build roads, and then an influx of homesteaders happened in the mid-20th century, and here we are today on the road system in Alaska with lots of wilderness left and just a beautiful environment to live in. So it's a really special place, and it's great to acknowledge our history and share that a little bit with some visitors. It's a really enlightening thing. Encourage people to go to the Quebec Cultural Site that is run by the Knights-Saath Indian tribe, and there's just so much to learn there. There's so much history to have reverence for in this area. So be sure to share that and any insights you may have. River health and protection. This really gets at kind of why we do what we do with Streamwatch across the board. We're trying to protect these rivers, the fish that run in them, and explain to people why that's so important and how they can be involved. So healthy salmon rivers, healthy fish rivers in general, are surrounded by diverse plants. It's as simple as that. I mean, you want to see ideally native plants. We don't want invasive plants, but you want to see a diverse range of native species around these rivers, and just kind of imagine a wild river. Imagine wilderness, a pristine river. That's what a healthy river will look like. All that vegetation will really help support clean, cold water, which is good for fish. And when we start to degrade that habitat that's all around the river, we start to degrade the river itself as well. So everything is very interconnected, and just encourage people to kind of make that link. When they're standing in the parking lot, the river might even be flowing in a subterranean channel under that parking lot. Groundwater connects to rivers, and so people all over the place in the watershed of the Kenai River or any of the other rivers that we work on are a part of that river system when they're there. And so encouraging people to really just think in a holistic way and understand that when they're recreating in Chugach National Forest or at Bing's Landing State Park, they are a part of these river systems that make up the Kenai Peninsula. It's really important. The reason that boardwalks and other infrastructure is built in these sites is to enable the rivers to stay healthy while supporting recreation, and we love our recreation in this area. So let's use that infrastructure that is so critical to making sure that we can have sustainable recreation on the Kenai Peninsula. Don't tread on or store gear on riverbanks. That's a big one. It's a sort of straw that broke the camel's back type situation. Just setting your backpack on the riverbank once won't have a big impact. But if 300,000 people every year are going to different sites on the Kenai Peninsula and unloading on the riverbank and walking on the riverbank, that will have a very, very dramatic impact. And so together, if we don't do that, we will minimize that footprint, keep the river happy and healthy. So we're all in it together. Okay, respect wildlife. This is a big one. We've talked a lot about bears already in this training, or we will talk about bears depending on the order of the slideshows when we upload these. But respecting wildlife is a huge part of how we educate people to be good stewards out on the river. We want to encourage people to store their personal gear responsibly. This means if you have personal equipment, especially food, you're storing it in a vehicle that's locked or in a bear-safe container, or keeping it on your person and being prepared with, a bear deterrent, ideally bear spray. We want to ask people to manage fish waste responsibly. We'll talk more about that, but those are stop, chop, and throw, or in certain circumstances to even pack it out, particularly at beaches during the dip net fisheries. Photos are great. Taking wildlife photography is awesome, but we want to encourage people to never approach a bear or another wild animal in order to take a better photo. Get a better lens. Don't approach a bear and risk getting mauled or having an unwanted interaction with that bear that might result in that bear getting killed. You want to be respectful of wildlife and their boundaries. This is their home and we are visiting. If you use wildlife deterrents, and this is a point to make to visitors, you'll see people with pistols, other firearms, all kinds of things, bear horns. If people are using wildlife deterrents, ask them to do it responsibly and to practice prevention first. We don't want people feeling like, oh, got a pistol or a rifle, I can do whatever I want and I'll just shoot the bear or, fire warning shots. We don't want to habituate bears to being close to people, and we also don't want to habituate people to being close to bears. There's boundaries that are really important. So let's practice those preventative skills first and encourage people to do so all the time on the rivers and set a good example. It's okay to take a photo of a bear as a Streamwatch ambassador, but do it respectfully. Maybe even take a few steps back first, even if you're already far away. Try to set your boundaries and just behave responsibly as you would want to see others behave. Okay, ethical angling. So there's a lot to this. Fishing regulations are a big part of ethical angling, and we do not cover fishing regulations for rivers on the Kenai Peninsula because they're dynamic, they change all the time, they're very complex, but the key thing is to know before you go, to tell people to do their research in advance, make sure that they know where they can find regulations. There are phone numbers for ADF&G in your volunteer manual. People can call ADF&G. There are resources available for people to know fishing regulations. And if you do know regulations that are up to date, you can communicate those to people. But again, you're not an enforcement agent in any way. You're not an officer. So encourage people to do research for themselves. Encourage people to follow regulations, to be responsible. But it's not your job to enforce them or know all of them. So don't worry, you don't need to know every I and T in the ADF&G regulations. But as you go out on the job, you'll learn more about them, and if there are emergency closures and that sort of thing, we can really help by providing information about that, and coordinators will often communicate that type of information to you during the season. So just bear that in mind. We ask people to keep their gear on their person. Again, please don't keep your gear on the riverbank, and keep stringers within 12 feet of you. So if somebody's fishing and they're 50 feet away from their stringer, we want to just ask them, hey, excuse me, ma'am, excuse me, sir, can you please, keep the stringer close to you? It's just mostly for bears, so that a bear doesn't come and steal your fish and get used to eating the stringer salad bar, basically. We want to ask people to deal with fish waste responsibly. So that's stop, chop, and throw. Get those fish pieces, once you've cut what you want off of them, into the middle of the river, into the fast-moving current where it'll get swept downstream and go back into the system. We don't want it hanging around, your feet as an angler. And there are variations of this at beaches in particular where we maybe don't want people to throw their fish waste into the surf, because what will happen at the dip net fishery is if someone's filleting their fish and just tosses even if they chop it up and toss the fish waste into the surf, it will just wash right back up onto the beach. So what we ask people to do in those circumstances is, gut your fish, kill it, or rather gill your fish, not gut it, gill your fish, let it bleed out, and then take the fish out whole. Put it on ice in your cooler, take the fish out whole, clean it elsewhere, and deal with that fish waste elsewhere. The Central Peninsula landfill has a place where people can deposit fish carcasses. And the reason for that is that if there's tons of fish waste on the beach, gulls will storm the beach. And with the gulls comes bird poop, and that bird poop actually carries harmful bacteria like coliform, E. coli, and other strains of harmful bacteria. And we really want to avoid that because it's a hazard to public health. And so that's the real purpose there, is just to, keep everything as sanitary as possible. So it's slightly different on the beach than it is at river sites, but if you're at a river site, stop, chop, and throw is pretty much the name of the game. That's what we hope people will do. Go to a cleaning table, clean your fish responsibly, and then deal with those discarded fish pieces by throwing them into the river in the fastest moving current. And if people are fishing catch and release, if folks are fly fishing or whatever, encourage them to use barbless hooks. It's more humane. It's easier to get them out of the fish's mouth before releasing it. Keep the fish wet. You want the trophy shot, but getting that fish out of water for a substantial period of time can really harm the fish. So handle it delicately, try to keep it in the water, and use a rubberized net so that the net doesn't get snagged on the fish. That can make it much harder to get the fish out of the water and other things. So rubberized nets, keep the fish wet, barbless hooks, those are all catch and release things. And catch and release is, for those folks who love fishing and want to get out and just cast, spend their day in the water, that is awesome. You'll see trout fishermen and fisherwomen out doing catch and release, and that's awesome. So there's some specific messaging for those folks. Okay, leave no trace is pretty much the name of the game anytime you're recreating out on public lands of any sort. This photo is a place where campers literally just abandoned their entire campsite. You can see there's a tent on the left, there's a fire pit with a bunch of cooking implements, a chair, and they hadn't been there for weeks. And so some Streamwatch volunteers very generously went out. This is at Kasilof Beach, and cleaned it up, picked up, there's a bunch of trash and food scraps, and it was, just basically leaving your entire campsite. And we really, maybe something bad happened, I don't know, hope the folks are okay, but we really want to see people coming and going and leaving a place cleaner than when they arrived, ideally. And even if it's a somewhat developed place like the Kasilof Beach there, there's parking lots and you can see some buildings in the background, but we really want to respect the fact that this is a beach and wildlife uses that beach. People recreate on that beach all the time, and we want to leave this place better than we found it. And so some of the messaging there is to plan ahead and prepare. Let people know that there are resources online. They can talk to folks. They can call visitor centers. They can call agencies and plan ahead. Know what amenities are available at these sites. If there aren't bathrooms, you can tell them to bring things like wag bags with a potty bucket and pack it out. We don't want people in these super high use areas just going to the bathroom anywhere. That can be another hazard to human health. That's an E. coli hazard. We want people to travel and camp on durable surfaces. At some sites, you can access legally, you can access some pretty delicate habitats. Like at Kasilof, you can access the dunes by the beach, and that's okay. There are some kind of deterrents, like some chain fencing, as you can see behind this campsite, but people can still get in there, and it's all right for them to be there under the law. But those are really delicate ecosystems, and so we want to encourage people to try to travel on, designated beach access, not to add new social trails through areas that may be delicate by a riverbank or by a beach dune like that. Dispose of waste properly. We've talked a lot about this. It's kind of pack it in, pack it out. That applies to garbage, fishing gear, fish waste. If you're catching fish at a site where we encourage people to pack it out, it applies to human waste and basically anything else. I mean, we want to leave these sites in good condition, ideally pristine and wild. That's here in Alaska, that's part of what makes this place so special, is that kind of wild and free atmosphere that we can find on public lands. Minimize campfire impacts. That's a really important one. You want to use existing fire rings whenever possible. Make sure you're not letting your fires smolder all night and start a forest fire. Just encourage people to be responsible. Leave what you find. If you find a really, really cool, like arrowhead or something, don't take it with you, or some sort of artifact. Leave it. Don't take it with you. Respect wildlife. We've already talked about that, and be considerate of other visitors. I think it's always okay if you see one group of visitors that's disturbing another group, or somebody barging in on a fishing group. It's okay to respectfully say, hey, I think they were here first, and there's a great fishing spot just up around the river bend. I can show you where it is. Be an encouraging voice and a positive presence, and try to help everyone have a good time. This is Alaska. It's huge. There's space for everybody who's going to be up here. So combat fishing, especially the kind of fishing where it's shoulder to shoulder at the Russian River, it can get a little tense. And so we can help dispel some of those tensions at moments by helping to show folks another good spot or that kind of thing. So let's talk about this messaging in action. You'll recognize this guy. Got him in another slideshow, and he's got his gear up on the riverbank. It's not on his person. Nothing about him. He might not even know, but we encourage people to keep their gear on their person and not store it on the riverbank for a variety of reasons, for wildlife, but also for the health of the riverbanks. And so he's having a great time. He's fishing, not really doing anything wrong, but we just want him to have that gear on his person. So I might approach this gentleman and say, "Oh, excuse me, sir, how's the fishing going?" And first try to break the ice a little bit, maybe drop a joke or two. And then, if you don't mind, sir, would you mind just grabbing your gear and keeping your gear on your person? I know it might feel a little bit clunky, but just for variety of reasons, for wildlife safety, to keep your gear from getting inspected by a bear, and also to make sure that we're caring for these riverbanks here. These are really delicate ecosystems that experience a lot of visitation. It's just much better if you keep your gear on your person. Could you do that for me? And, if he's hostile and doesn't want to do it, then I can step back and say, okay, I'm sorry, sir, but just, please just trying to respect the site. But, have a good day. Thank you. You don't have to be aggressive back. In fact, try to dispel tensions. Don't be aggressive back. Try to, relax the situation and try to keep things calm. If he does continue to just fish and not get his gear, again, you're not a regulator. You're not an officer. You don't need to enforce the rules. Don't take it personally. It's not you. Just, let it be, and maybe you can tell a coordinator or somebody else who may have regulating authority if you do think that they're violating a rule or a law. If he complies, then, oh, thank you so much, sir. That's awesome. Maybe you've got a stringer or another handout. We do have handouts in Streamwatch caches. You can be like, thank you so much, sir. Since you're working with us and being a good river steward, here's a stringer. That kind of thing goes a long way. People feel thanked. They feel gratified for working with you, and usually 99% of the time, those interactions go really well. In the event of something hostile, again, proceed cautiously, try to dispel tension. You can always let a coordinator or another agency contact person, that contact information is in your volunteer manual. You can always let those folks know. Okay, that's the brunt of our sort of educational material. There's a lot more to learn, but the best way to learn it is just by doing it, getting out on the river, get out with a coordinator or some of the volunteers who are really experienced and have them show you how they do things. It can be really, really great to learn from people on the job. Trust me, I know I was new last year as a coordinator and I learned a ton from volunteers and my fellow Streamwatch staff and agency support. The next section, I'm going to talk about fish identification. Okay, so fish ID is another thing that we can help people with while we're down on the river. We have laminated sheets that have fish identification information on them. Occasionally there are like little handouts that we can pass out to people. But if you know in your mind how to identify fish, you can really help people while they're out on the river. So the first one, big one, huge fisheries for these guys in all the Kenai Peninsula rivers where we work are sockeye salmon. So sockeye are very recognizable when they're spawning because of their red body and their very green head and their distinct hook nose. Some other salmon look somewhat similar, but it's usually pretty easy to recognize a sockeye when it's like full on spawning. When it's not, when it's more recently entered the river from the sea, it'll have kind of a dark blue back with silvery sides. So you'll notice like a distinct change in the coloring from the top of the fish to the sides of the fish. And it doesn't have any distinct spots on the back, dorsal fin, or tail. So you're not going to see a lot of spots in this region. On the dorsal fin, back here, you're not going to see any spots, really. There may be an occasional kind of odd mark or something, but there's not really like a spotting pattern on the tail or the dorsal fin. Okay, so king salmon, Chinook salmon. A lot of people are really excited about catching Chinook salmon on the Kenai River. How do you recognize them? Well, they're going to have a kind of blue-gray back with silver sides, not super different coloring from a sockeye, but they will have small, irregular-shaped black spots on their back. Again, this is that area that sockeye don't really have spots. King salmon do have spots there. On their dorsal fin, they have spots. And on their tail, they may have some spots on both lobes of the tail. So that's something to look for. And then in their mouth, they have black mouths and black gums at the base of the teeth on the lower jaw. So like if you catch your fish and you open the mouth and it's black all along their gums on their lower jaw, that's a good way to recognize a king. And the distinction with coho salmon, with silver salmon in the mouth, will even make it more clear. So, and then when king salmon are getting ready to spawn, they lose that kind of silvery bright color. That's down below here is the spawning king, and they'll kind of turn maroon, olive brown. They don't get that super distinctive red like a sockeye. They kind of turn, more kind of like olivey, sometimes a little bit rosy colored. So those are kings. And here is a coho, a silver salmon. So again, coloring straight out of the sea. When they're starting to run up the river, it's kind of greenish blue back with silvery sides. They'll have small black spots, a little bit like a king, on their back, on their dorsal fin, and on their tail, but usually only on their upper lobe of the tail. And kings usually have it on both lobes of the tail. So that's an important distinctive note between, like if you catch a smaller king, it might look a lot like a coho, but if it has a lot of spots on the lower lobe of the tail, that's a pretty good sign that it's a king. Instead of a coho, which will only have spots on the upper lobe of the tail. And then in the mouth, it'll have a black mouth, but instead of having black gums at the base of the teeth on the lower jaw, it will have white gums at the base of the teeth. So there's that distinction again between a coho and a king. With a king, it's a black mouth, black gums by the lower teeth, And with a silver, it's going to be black mouth and whiter gums. And spawning coho develops that kind of greenish head. Sockeye are usually a little more distinctly green heads. But yeah, silver's greenish head and kind of dark brown maroon bodies, usually a little less red as well than sockeye salmon. So it's pretty easy to tell them apart once they're really getting spawny. Okay, pink salmon, often referred to as humpies. When they're getting ready to spawn, it's really easy to recognize them because their snout kind of turns up and they have this really distinct hump on their back. It's like super obvious that they're humpies when they're more ready to spawn. But when they're not yet there, what do they look like? So they're going to have kind of this darker back and then silvery sides, again, like most salmon. But they're going to have larger spots in their back. Usually they're fairly large and distinctive. And oval blotches on both tail lobes. So these are not just spots like on kings, where kings may have spots on both tail lobes, but they're on pinks, they're like larger ovals, and you can really see it in this lower photo. It's almost like leopard print or something like that. It's pretty distinctive when you see it. So yeah, you can pick up pretty easily on pink salmon. In pink salmon years, like 2020, there were a ton of pink salmon. You'd catch 5 for every sockeye once you got into late July, and so it's pretty easy to tell a pink. Most people learn pretty fast. All right, a couple other species. Most folks are going to be fishing for salmon, but there will be trout fishing going on, no doubt. And at certain sites, like on the Anchor River, there's going to be a lot of people who are trying to catch steelhead. And so how do you distinguish trout from salmon? Well, rainbow trout are actually also a member of the salmon genus, so they're very closely related. But there's a couple distinct things. One is you can see that the body of this is a rainbow. This fish probably hasn't run out to sea much, which is what makes a steelhead. A steelhead is a sea-run rainbow trout. But you can see on this one, it's spotted. Most of its body is spotted. It's kind of greenish, and it's got this like blush line, this beautiful kind of rainbow line down the middle of its body. And they're pretty easy to recognize. The shape of their face is also like a little more rounded by the nose, and it's fairly easy to recognize a rainbow trout. Steelhead will lose some of that kind of olive greenish coloring, and they'll get much more silvery looking, but they will still have that kind of mid-body blush that a rainbow trout has, and a pretty distinct facial structure. Their head structure, looks fairly similar to this fish. They'll just be bigger. And sometimes in the Kenai River, you'll get huge rainbows that haven't really run out to sea, but they look a little more silvery and a little bit more like steelhead. And in part, it's just because they're big fish. So that's always exciting to catch a big rainbow trout in the Kenai. There are steelhead as well that have run to sea, but sometimes there's just really big ones that haven't been out to sea also. So you'll learn best by seeing these fish in real life, but there's just some examples that you can use. And the last fish that I will talk about is Dolly Varden. Dollies are actually a char species, so they're not trout, although people often think that they're trout. And the easiest way to tell a dolly from a trout, if you're not experienced handling these fish, is by looking at these spots on the rainbow. Those spots will be kind of darker and kind of like brownish or various shades of darker colors. On char, they're going to be bright. They kind of pop. It's almost like they're fluorescent. These ones are really bright. On some dollies, it's a little less obvious, but they'll be kind of like pinkish and they almost glow. It's gorgeous when you catch a dolly. But that's one way that you can tell a char from a trout. And there are folks fishing for dollies in a lot of these rivers as well. So I hope that's helpful on the fish ID side and, of course, on the educational side. In conclusion, be respectful and kind. Be fun if you want to be fun. You also don't have to be an educator if you're not naturally inclined to talk to people. You can do more of the kind of hands-on stuff, doing marine debris pickups or litter pickups. You can help with fencing. But if you do want to talk to people, be respectful, be kind, be fun, share your knowledge with people willing to listen. You're there as kind of an interpretive guide for folks to provide that enlightening experience. And I learn from you all every time I get out on the river. So folks are sure to learn from you. Be a role model, not an enforcement officer. That's really important. Even if folks think you're an enforcement officer, make it clear you're not there to enforce. You're just there as a volunteer, and you're there to help. Be a positive influence. Share your love for the river. Why are you an ambassador? Is a question you can always fall back on, and just talk to people about why you're doing this and why you care about the river, why it's so special. So thank you so much. That concludes this section.